Welcome to literary and jury charge practice. Let's start out with a little warm-up. It's a short opinion of the court. Ready? Here we go. In this case, the defendant was convicted of 2 counts of arson. The attorney for the defendant contended that the state had not made a thorough, complete, and intensive investigation of the circumstances of the crime. He contended that if the state had done so, it would have been found that there were some other logical conclusions which could have been reached just as easily as the conclusion that it was the defendant who set the fire in question. This was just one of the various defenses that were presented by the counsel for the defendant in his attempt to prevent the defendant from being convicted. The attorney for the state countered with the opinion that the investigation was sufficient to prove that the defendant was indeed the one who had set the fire. First, the bottle with the gasoline and wick was found on the roof of the bar, and the defendant was seen on the roof just a few minutes before the conflagration. The defense simply did not convince me that the defendant was somewhere else at the time. The 2 people who said that they saw the defendant in the area of the fire at the time in question told their stories in a convincing manner. His presence in close proximity to the bar at a time so close to the time of the fire seems to me to be conclusive. And we had a new word in there that we might want to add to our list of challenging words. Conflagration. Conflagration. All right, now we will move on to a little more jury charge practice. And the subject of this jury charge, which we had already previously started, is industrial accident. So we'll get back to this one now. Ready? Here we go. The plaintiff in substance claims that the defendant was negligent in placing the crossarm within 3 feet of the roof of the shed when it should have been at least 8 feet above such roof, that is, out of the reach of a person on the roof. That the defendant was also negligent in failing to properly insulate the electric wires within reach from said roof, or where persons working on said elevator were likely to come in contact with such wires, that the plaintiff's decedent was rightfully in close proximity to the wires just before the accident, and that these acts of negligence on the part of the defendant were the sole cause of the accident. The defendant, on the other hand, denies that it was negligent and claims that the construction was in the usual form and type in such cases. Defendant further claims that the plaintiff's decedent was himself negligent and that his negligence caused or contributed to cause the accident, that he knew of these wires and the amount of voltage carried, that he knew the wire in question carried 2300 volts and that contact therewith was deadly, that he deliberately came in contact with the wire in question, and that his negligence on his part was the proximate cause of his death, that he had been often warned of the danger of these electric wires and that he willfully disregarded such warnings. So the issues in this case present questions of negligence, questions of fact for the jury to determine. Under our method of trying lawsuits, it is the duty of the court to pass upon and determine all questions of law, and it is the duty and privilege of the jury to decide all questions of fact, those questions of fact that are submitted to the jury by the court. Whose negligence caused this accident? Was it caused by the negligence of the plaintiff's decedent, Felix J. Schroeder, or was it caused by the negligence of the defendant, the city of Rogers, or was it caused by the negligence of both of them? Negligence on the part of any person is the failure on the part of such person to exercise such care as a person of ordinary prudence would have exercised under the same circumstances. The amount of care which a person must exercise necessarily varies with the circumstances in which he is placed. In each case, he must exercise such care as a person of ordinary care would exercise under the same or like circumstances. Failure to do that is negligence in the eyes of the law. Now, distributors of electricity are bound to use reasonable care in the construction and maintenance of their lines and apparatus. The degree of care varies with the danger involved. Where wires carry strong and dangerous currents of electricity, a high degree of care must be exercised, but the distributor is not an insurer of safety. Now let's try some literary practice. And this is called 100 plus years of our profession and counting. Ready? Here we go. The duties of a court reporter, often referred to as a stenographer, have essentially remained the same for the past 100 years. The primary task of a court reporter is to capture the spoken word. Technology, of course, has made the job of a court reporter much easier. From feather quills to computers, the evolution of the profession has been quite remarkable. Before the invention of an official shorthand, court proceedings were taken down in full writing. Of course, getting everything accurately was probably a stretch, but a basic summation of what occurred was recorded. The proceedings were then put into some form of legible document, today referred to as a transcript, which could later be reviewed by the attorneys and judges for appeal purposes. In the early 19th century, Isaac Pitman invented a phonetic shorthand theory that enabled stenographers to record proceedings at quicker speeds. The theory of shorthand was adopted by pen writers throughout the English-speaking world. Pitman then produced a varied number of new editions of his theory. However, some of his modifications did not bode well with the international shorthand community. One of the major changes was the placement of dot vowels. He reversed the order of the dot vowels and published his new theory in his following edition. This slight modification rattled a few foundations throughout the steno community. After spending months, even years, crafting their skills with the original version, writers were faced with having to adopt these basic changes if they wanted to keep up with progressing trends. The British, in tradition stiff upper lip fashion, accepted the changes, stating that the modification would be the last they would accept. The Americans, however, in true rebellious fashion, were less accommodating. Some adopted the new theory. However, others produced their separate shorthand versions, keeping the vowels where they originally were. This resulted in several different versions, although not too dissimilar to the original version. We will get back to that. Now let's try some more jury charge practice. Here we go. Ready? A city which undertakes to furnish electric lights and power to the public is subject to the same duties and liabilities and possesses the same rights and privileges as private persons or corporations furnishing the same kind or class of service. Such city owes to the public the duty of so inspecting and maintaining its distributing plant as to prevent changes and deterioration from natural causes resulting in dangerous conditions. The degree of care required must be commensurate with the danger known or reasonably to be apprehended to those who may have occasion to come in proximity to high voltage wires. This duty, so resting upon the distributor of electricity, applies to all places and equipment where people may go for work, business, or pleasure, and in such places the distributor is required to provide necessary insulation of its wires and equipment so as to protect people rightfully in proximity with such wires or equipment, and the higher the voltage, the greater the care required. This rule applies to installation as well as insulation. Installation must be made to comply with standard or usual requirements and should, when reasonably possible, be so made that high voltage wires cannot be easily reached by persons rightfully upon the premises. If one does an act and he knows, or by the exercise of reasonable foresight should have known, that injury may result from his act, the act committed is negligent and will be deemed to be the proximate cause of the accident or injury. Those who are engaged in transmitting high voltage electricity are required to exercise a degree of care to guard against injury, and where the operators of electric power maintain high tension wires at places where workmen or people may rightfully be, it is the duty of such distributors of electricity to provide effective insulation as well as other safeguards, but they are not required to provide such insulation or safeguards where they have no reason to expect that people will go. The plaintiff's decedent, Felix J. Schroeder, was also required to exercise due care under the circumstances for his own safety. The danger of electrical energy is a matter of common knowledge, and all persons are held to a certain minimum of knowledge common to the community. The question is not what a person does know about electricity, but what the law assumes that he knows. A person of ordinary intelligence is assumed to possess such scientific knowledge about the degrees of electricity as is common among laymen in the community at the time. If a person recklessly exposes himself to known or imminent danger unnecessarily in a manner that a person of ordinary care would not do under the circumstances, he assumes the risk of such danger and is guilty of contributory negligence and cannot recover for any injury sustained by him under such circumstances. The same rule applies if some other person brings suit for his death. This is one of the important questions in this case. Was the deceased guilty of negligence which either caused or contributed to cause the accident? The plaintiff cannot recover any damages in this case if at the time of the accident her husband was himself negligent, that is, if he failed to exercise reasonable care for his own safety, such care as men of ordinary and reasonable prudence usually exercise under the same or similar circumstances, and if such negligence was a substantial factor or a material element in causing the accident. The first question that you will take up and determine when you retire to the jury room is whether the defendant, the City of Rogers, was negligent in the manner and as claimed by the plaintiff. If you fail to find from the preponderance of the evidence, that is, by the greater weight of the evidence, that it was negligent in the respect claimed, then you need consider this case no further. But if you find that the City of Rogers was in fact negligent, then you will consider whether or not such negligence was the proximate cause of the accident. The burden of proof rests upon the plaintiff to prove by the greater weight of the evidence that the City of Rogers was negligent and that its negligence caused the accident in question. If on this question of the defendant's negligence you find the evidence evenly balanced or preponderating in defendant's favor, then you will find a verdict of no cause of action. The burden of proof rests upon the defendant to prove by the greater weight of the evidence that the husband of the plaintiff was negligent and that his negligence proximately caused or contributed to cause the accident in question. If on this question of his negligence you find the evidence evenly balanced or preponderating in plaintiff's favor, then you will find that the plaintiff's husband was not negligent. If you find under the rules given you that the City of Rogers was negligent and that its negligence proximately caused the accident in question, and you find that the plaintiff's husband was not guilty of negligence, then your verdict will be for the plaintiff for the damages which you find that the plaintiff has sustained. On the other hand, if you find under the rules given you that the accident was caused by the sole negligence of plaintiff's husband and that the defendant was not guilty of negligence which caused the accident, or if you find that both the plaintiff's decedent and the defendant were negligent, and the negligence of both of them proximately contributed to cause the accident, then the plaintiff cannot recover in this case, and you will find a verdict of no cause of action. If you find a verdict for the plaintiff, then the next question is the amount of damages to be awarded. The damages to be awarded are solely by way of compensation for pecuniary damages for the pain and suffering, the loss suffered by the widow and her children. You can allow no damages for the pain and suffering of the deceased, nor can you allow any damages for the grief or mental pain or suffering of the widow and the children. The test is what, in view of all the facts shown by the evidence, was the probable pecuniary interest of the beneficiaries in the continuance of the life of the decedent. A proper estimate may be arrived at by taking into account the occupation of the deceased and the salary or income therefrom, his health, age, probable duration of life, talents, habits of industry, success in life in the past, and the amount of aid in money or services which he was accustomed to furnish his family. All is found from the evidence in this case. The surviving widow and minor children had a legal claim upon the deceased for their support, and it is presumed that they suffered from pecuniary loss, but the amount of such loss is for the jury to determine in this case. In this case, there being no proof of any damages, such as funeral expenses, doctor bills, and expenses caused by the death, they are not in the case, and you cannot allow anything for them. You will take into consideration all the facts found by you from the evidence in the case. It is for you to determine from the facts in the case as you find them what the pecuniary loss was, and you will determine and decide what the amount of damage is if you find that the plaintiff is entitled to recover. The fact that Felix J. Schroeder left a widow and children dependent upon him recommends itself strongly to sympathy, but you are instructed in determining the issues in this case that you are not to be controlled or guided in any degree by any sympathy, bias, or prejudice toward the plaintiff or toward anybody, but you must determine this case wholly and solely on the evidence and determine therefrom and without any sympathy, bias, or prejudice the issues of negligence and contributory negligence which have been submitted to you. Let's try a little more from our literary that we had started about 100 plus years of our profession. Ready? Here we go. Fractions of these shorthand theories were used for many years until the arrival of a young, ambitious Irish immigrant called John Gregg. Often referred to as the Apple Macintosh of the 19th century, a new version of shorthand that Gregg created had many more appealing factors. Still phonetic in nature, Gregg's shorthand proved to be more efficient than Pitman. It allowed the stenographer to keep the pen on the surface of the paper so hand movements flowed easier. Pitman's version had both thick and thin lines, whereas Gregg's version depended on lighter strokes. Although both versions were used, in the end it was Gregg's creation that won the popular vote. Gregg still remains the most popular version of pen shorthand to this day in North America. Despite these advances in efficient note-taking, the pace of technology quickly caught up with stenographers at the dawn of the 20th century with the invention of the first functional stenotype machine. Created in 1877 by an American named Miles Bartholomew, this remarkable machine, comprising only 10 keys, enabled the user to use the keys to press singularly or at the same time to capture the spoken word with a combination of dots and dashes. There were various improvements to this original prototype over the ensuing years. The modern steno machine keyboard that most resembles the keyboard used today by stenographers made its debut a few decades later. Still based on the use of phonetics, the machine enabled the operator to create briefs, allowing for entire phrases to be taken down at once. Extra keys were added and letters were assigned to each key or a combination thereof. A typical brief, for example, is the phrase "beyond a reasonable doubt." These 4 words can be written simultaneously and would look like this on a typical stenotype machine: KWRAEURD. All it took to record this simple phrase was 1 stroke, all relevant keys being depressed at once. This was transferred to a roll of paper similar in appearance to a grocery store bill, which was then typed up by the stenographer or a note reader who could decipher these mysterious combination of letters. The demise of Pittman Gregg shorthand pen writers in the court system began much earlier. However, in 1914, at a national shorthand speed competition, hundreds of hopeful pen writers crowded the convention when it walked a group of teenage competitors. Sponsored by the Universal Stenotype Company, these upstart youths were trained to operate steno machines at equal or in excess speeds of the most seasoned of pen writers. These machine writers managed to win every contest and walked off with all the awards. Alarmed at this new technological development and fearing for their very livelihood, contest winners pulled the plug on the national competition for 5 years. However, by the time the next national competition returned in 1919, the point had been made. Even though machine writers were banned from the competition, it was too late. Machine writers had already begun to replace pen writers in courtrooms across America. Today, there are thousands of court reporters employed in various aspects of the profession. Developing computer technology has enabled court reporters to be useful in other areas besides the courtroom. One of these areas is called CART, or Communication Access Real-Time Translation. This enables the end user to read almost simultaneously what is being spoken on a computer or television screen. Specialized software is programmed to translate the reporter's machine strokes, turning the seemingly unintelligible mass of letters into a comprehensible language. This is particularly helpful for people who are hard of hearing, who use the services of court reporters to follow live proceedings such as the news, government hearings, sporting events, and even in university courses. All right, and that will conclude our literary and jury charge practice.